Morning. Good morning and welcome to the TC Dojo. Today is part 3, Concepts and Techniques of Library Science, or how library science can improve not just your lives of your customers, but of you also. We've got lots and lots of content that we deal with every day in order to put our information together for our customers' consumption, and us being able to find it is just as important as them being able to find it. So again, this is part 3. Usually this is a 2-day workshop, so that I've managed to get it into 3 half-hour segments is kind of amazing. It is just the basics, but you know, library scientists, those are the people who specialize in how to store, find, and retrieve and deliver information to anybody who comes in on any subject, right? And they are not subject matter experts themselves in all the subjects that we find in our local libraries. So we use their expertise to help give us a way of categorizing and cataloging our information, not just for us, but for our customers. Today's part 3. Hopefully you've seen the other 2. They're on YouTube on our TC Dojo channel if you want to see them, and that's where this one will be too. Okay, so just to refresh from part 1, we talked about organizing principles and access points. Remember, you can organize your fridge any way that makes sense to you. We had one example where everything was divided by, it looks like, store bag. That's how they knew where something was. And on the other one, we had something that looked more organized by drinks on the top, dairy on the second shelf, and storage kind of on the last one. So you can organize your fridge any way you want. You can put all the red things on one shelf. You can put all the condiments on one shelf. You can put all the tall items on the tall shelf. And my customer actually would be really unhappy that the brie was on the top shelf where all the tall things were, because he liked things to be organized by size. Right? It doesn't really matter. You have to make sure that your organizing principles are set up so that the access points are the way that you fetch information. And you use scope as a way to break that data up so that you can either group it in bigger or smaller ways or other ways that are useful. You don't necessarily care really what these buckets are, just that the buckets exist and they make sense to you and they work for how you think about your information and how you retrieve it. And this is often quite different for someone who's writing and managing content than someone who's using it to do particular tasks. The writing and content teams versus the customer. You're looking for information in very different ways because you're going at it for very different purposes. Okay, so from part 2, we talked about some of the methods to facilitate search. We talked about control vocabulary and keywords. And my example was turkey. That's my favorite one. Do you mean the country, the bird, or are you looking for recipes for Thanksgiving? And as much as you care about the buckets, you really care about what the question is and what kind of search tasks either you or your customers are going through. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to filter that down today. So we talked about control vocabulary being specific keywords. You mark things according to a specified vocabulary that everybody in the group agrees on. Dewey Decimal System, Library of Congress system, whatever system you want. There's many, many out there, and they have pluses and minuses depending on the audience. But you all agree that something is blue. It's not azure or teal or sky blue or ocean blue. It's blue, right? And you all apply the same words the same way. That way you could all find the same thing the same way. The other example was, I think, was plane crash. Or maybe that's today's example, so we'll come back to that in a minute. The turkey example also talks about how you leverage what you know about content, what you remember, and it helps you find other search methods. So we've got access point plus scope plus control vocabulary and keywords. You can either, when you get a search results back, think of the last search you did on your favorite search engine. You get too many results and then you add some words or you subtract some words so that you can narrow your results and get what you're actually looking for. Sometimes you can get results that are too narrow and you want to be able to push it open a little bit more and get a bigger result set because you didn't quite know what word it was someone else used to describe the thing that you're trying to get. So narrowing or expanding your search is a key part of creating your control vocabulary, and controlling your search methods and your access points. Okay, so we're going to cover the last 4, numerical, time, date, natural language, and combined searching today, and then talk about a little bit of best practices. And I talked pretty quick, but hopefully the video will be on YouTube also again. So, and if you need help doing this, this is where we specialize. Don't hesitate to call us. Okay, so our access points again in part 2, just real quick to remember. Control of vocabulary, benefits, everybody looks at the world the same way, but drawbacks, it's not always obvious how something should be categorized. If it matters that the picture is azure, it's important because azure was a color that has specific chemical properties and it was the first artist to use it, then not labeling it as blue is not necessarily what you're trying to do, or doesn't give you the best results. So you can have plus and minus for controlled vocabulary. But you do get that highly structured, rigorously constructed hierarchical taxonomy that controlled vocabulary really excels with. Keywords are ways to expand the access points and give you a little bit more flexibility than the controlled vocabulary. That example was Philippines versus Filipino versus Filipino. Different members of the community spell and think of it different ways. By adding different keywords, you can expand your access points so somebody coming to you can look at it from their perspective and you can continue. So benefits, you use more natural language along with control language, but your drawbacks, you always need to know, you always need to add those additional keywords in order to backfill. Okay, so some best practices. Keywords are descriptors that are never really appear in content. This is the most important point I can make. You don't want metadata where the thing that you're searching for is something you type all the time in your text, like a product name. You want to build in mental baggage, but you want precision, and you don't want to return, if your content management system has full text search also, you don't want it to return all those other values. You don't want to have the overhead of people marking up metadata that's in the full text. It's a lot of overhead and not a lot of value from it. So, but if you think about it in a different way, if you're looking for bartending recipes, none of them have bar or bartending in them. You get a list of ingredients and steps, right? They might say cocktails, but probably not. And something like BLT, is that a branch leadership team or a sandwich? And what about graphics and photographs? For those, it's more important that you have very good descriptive keywords because there's nothing to search for usually in a graphic. There's some special cases, but graphics are typically binary and hard to search, right? This is a known problem in computer science. So we go to something like numerical access points, and so we'll talk about a little bit how the Library of Congress system works actually. And you can watch the video, it's actually kind of fascinating, the Library of Congress classification system. The link is there at the bottom. Numerical access points give you a way to subdivide your big buckets into smaller buckets and give you a way to identify and locate something very, very quickly. For example, you've got B is always philosophy or religion or theology, then 210 is prayer, C53 is for chambers, 1915 is the edition date, and C2 is copy 2. I can look at that key, I can look at the code and know exactly what book it is, and more importantly, I can know exactly where it is in the library. There's all kinds of ways to think about this, and some of the standards use a standard numbering system in sort of this same way, S1000D being the one that comes to mind. For them, the topics have numbers, official numbers, that start at the front of whatever it is they're documenting, goes to the back and starts at the center line and moves out. Based on the code attached to the topic, they know exactly what part of the airplane they're talking about or what it applies to. So there's all kinds of ways you can use numerical access points to help guide all kinds of things. You might have very specific numbering codes set up for your documents, and you know if the 100s are missing, the front matter is missing, and the book is not yet complete. So you can do some automatic testing of content before it even goes to your customers. There's all kinds of ways that numerical access points can help you. It's just one of any number of ways. It's used specifically to help you identify uniquely any specific content unit in your information system, whether it's a content management or the library. I'll recommend the video because it's actually kind of interesting, but there's all kinds of ways that numerical access points can help you along with your keyword, along with your natural language, along with your controlled language to help you get to what you're looking for specifically, right? Because you can work your way down the column of numbers and just look at the first one or look at the first two or look at the first three, right? Each time you're narrowing your scope or expanding it, going the other direction. Time, date, access points. This is something that everybody expects to have, and we all are kind of actually used to thinking of. You remember perhaps I was working on that piece of content last summer because that's when I had to take off for a week and I wanted to finish before I was done. So it's likely I was working on it the first 2 weeks of July. So as long as you can look for content that you worked on, so that's last modified, and you can find out when it was, sometime between July 1 and July 15 when you know you left, you can identify, locate, and find the pinpoint the content that you wanted, and you can use time to do it. Typically, these are very common in any CMS or file system. You get last modified, you get created, you get some audit trail information, you get publication dates, you get release dates, you get revisions versus iterations, you get all kinds of time date access points that usually are built into your content management or file system at some level. You might need to have this sort of coordinated with a ticketing system or bug tracking system or anything like that, but it helps you sort of pinpoint something, and now you've got a different axis to work on to locate the content you're looking for. Okay, so say we were looking for keywords, we were looking for a particular painting, we looked under blue, we got a whole bunch of things. We know it was created in the 1600s. Actually, we know it was created by an author. We can sort of narrow things down for there. So the more access points you have, the more ways you have of getting information. And time is one of those ways we as humans look at and think about where we're at and where our content is and relate to it. Okay, so natural language, this would be one of the more interesting ones, or one of the ones we think of as very common. Natural languages uses the terms we usually use in speech, things that we say. Yahoo is one of those sites actually that we call out for this. I don't know if anybody remembers, but way back in the day they had, or they actually think they still do, when they first started up though, they had this browse system. And you could start somewhere and work your way down a hierarchy to locate something. Librarians were hired by Yahoo to create all of that. All that taxonomy and all those browsing and all of that stuff. And they built in ways to connect natural language to the records so you could get to it also. It's kind of an interesting story for Yahoo, but that, if you still want to see it, you can go look at the browsing part of it and you can see where that was constructed. The problem is when there's more than one term to describe something, you kind of, natural language lets you embed that stuff in there, so more than one term they get a chance to look at it, right? ATM versus cash machine, Pepsi versus soda versus Coke. Right, depending on what part, or pop, depending on what part of the country you're in. If you have natural language that lets you add all of that stuff, then you have a chance for whoever is coming to you to be able to locate what they're looking for. Problem is, natural language has the tendency to give you more results than you expect. And so you need to make sure that the terms in there are just the ones you need so that it can be narrowed down and you don't get too many. Right, just because and the other big one, this is the one down here in the bottom right corner, when you are adding natural language to a descriptor for a piece of content, just because you view the world that way doesn't mean anyone else does, right? So the strength of controlled language and keywords, where everybody views the same word the same way and everything is marked from the same perspective, that's the drawback of it is the strength of natural language, and the drawback to natural language is the strength of the keyword, right? Not everybody looks at the world the same way. If I write pop into a description of soda around the world, or soda machines, and I write pop because that's how I look at the world, coming from Michigan, then that would work out really well. But if somebody from the South comes looking and they're looking for soda, they're not going to find the content that I've marked up because I don't think of it that way. So you can have a little bit of issues going back and forth with natural language, but it also gives you space to describe things so that users can come to it naturally, right? One of the hardest things for us when we buy a new product, any one of us, is to figure out how that company and those writers view the world so that when you're looking for something, you put yourself into their shoes and say, well, I'm looking for this, but I don't know what the word is for that. So if I think about what do they have, right? You might go to an index or a table of contents and try to figure out what words that company uses to view the world that can help you get to what you want, because their natural language embedded in that culture and in that product is different from yours coming at it brand new. Right. So, for example, here's another good one. You build a website. Any company, any person builds a website with certain things in mind because you want to be known in that specific way. You're doing it on purpose when you construct it. But then a spider crawls your site, and you get thrown in with a lot of weird stuff based on whatever words were in there. We were just doing SEO actually on our own website recently, and Google thinks certain things about certain pages because there's words in there. But it's not really applicable for somebody who's searching for that term would not want that page. So we're addressing how that works, but this is part of what we're talking about. So here's an example and something if you just want to look at words and how they work together. This is Visual Thesaurus. It's kind of a nifty little app on the web somewhere. It gives you examples and it shows you visually how things relate. So when I was talking about turkey, the country, the bird, Thanksgiving, I didn't even put bomb or dud or joker, right? All of those are just as equally likely parts of the question that someone was coming. I want things on turkey. Does that mean you're looking for, J.J. Walker, hey, joker, right? So you kind of have to think about things from multiple perspectives when you are figuring out your controlled language and your natural language. So general best practice is actually to combine most of these strategies, many different access points. The more axes you have, the more likely someone is to find the specific piece of content they're looking for. Remember back to our math class and imagine a graph where you've got X, Y, and Z axis, right? You got 3 points. You can find any point in space in a three-dimensional view. Right? If you've got a natural language location, a time-based location, an author location, and some keywords, some controlled language, you can likely get your search result down to a very small piece. And it's not too hard to sort through. If not necessarily, you might actually get only one. We have a customer who has a massive amount of graphic libraries. They have 2 or 3 or more graphics on almost every page. And they figured that they needed 4 access points and they could find any single graphic. They would know it absolutely, any single one out of hundreds of them with only 4 points. Right? So this is part of what we're talking about. So if you have more points, you can sort of facilitate that. Natural language gives you sort of another way to add to that, to give you different ways of thinking about it. Some of them, they had an example of, I had one customer, had an example who said, the question from the customer was, how do I set up my security? And they're like, oh, well, roles, permissions, it's this chapter. And the question sort of came back and said, no, I was looking at how to set up my video camera. Right? That is security. For some people, setting up the video camera outside the building, that is security. But the way he thinks of security, the way the people internally thought of security, very different. Right? He's not looking for roles or permissions and, setting up SSL or whatever in the system. He was looking for a bigger sort of process description. How do I set up the camera? What steps do I need to go through? Right? So you kind of need, by combining access points, you get to take the drawbacks from one and give it the strengths of another. Right? So you want to include terms that are somewhere in the content itself or in the search record. Another example is the did a short description. If you ever done a Google search, you see the blue text, it's the underline, and you get a little bit of text underneath. That, if you're lucky enough to get some data topics from IBM, that text underneath the blue link comes from the short description in the data topics. That's the thing that helps you differentiate one page from another. Right? So there's ways to let your control vocabulary work to your benefit as well as help you differentiate as well as your users. Okie doke. We're getting close now. So remember that when you are tagging content for your content repository, you are both a librarian and a searcher. As a librarian, you're curating and cataloging, and you're modifying keywords, and you're thinking about who your searchers are, right? You're not thinking about only your end user. As a writer, we're taught to think of our end user, the person using our content. As a librarian, curating content in our content management system, we are as valid a user as any other person in our company, as well as our customers who are external to us. It may be that you are in a med device company, which is someone else we helped out a while ago. They had very specific types of searches that people in the regulatory affairs office did. And regulatory affairs asks very specific kinds of questions like, is this material in this product because we're shipping to the EU and this is not allowed, or this is, right? And we need to know. So, and that's a very different kind of question than a user coming to the product saying, well, how do I put this together? They may or may not care what the materials are, right? Because they're not importing or exporting, and that's not what they're looking for. It's likely not what your writer putting the book together is looking for either. And yet, this was an access and a user, a searcher audience that they needed to account for. Right? So you need to make sure you put yourself in both positions. As a searcher, what are you looking for? How do you approach that task? If you had to search for it, had to find it, what steps do you go through? Right? What searches do you do? What questions do you get? And this is a very hard thing to step outside ourselves and see this, because we just do it. We're in the middle of it all. We're part of it. We're in the culture. We're embedded in our products. We just do it. It's very hard to ask yourself, to look at yourself and say, well, how did I get those steps? But that's one of the things you need to do in order to think of yourself as the reference librarian and not the writer. Right? One of the ways to do this is to construct both the control vocabulary and a summary with keywords so you know who's searching, right? You need to think through everybody, your internal, your internal but team external searchers. You sort of start doing profiles just like you would do for your audience analysis for your users of content. You can do this same thing looking at your internal searchers as well. This is not something that is unfamiliar to writers. We're used to doing it, but we're not used to thinking of ourselves as the one that we're investigating. And you start constructing user profiles. One of the things you can all do to start right now, if you want to get ready for something like this, start writing it down. Any question you get, somebody stops by your desk, sends you an email, picks up the phone, calls you, they ask you questions. Tech pubs are the keepers of all things information, even when it's just, hey, where's that manual? Right? You point them to the website. Here's the URL. It's always here. Right? But you are the keeper of the information because you are the one who writes it, puts it together. Right? So and questions come to us, we answer them, and we forget them. We don't ever think that anybody ever asked us that question because it's so transitory and easy and fast to do. Right? So my recommendation is always to write it down and write it as long as you can. It doesn't matter if it's just a sheet of scratch paper. Make sure you write who asked it. Was it an end user? Was it sales? Was it regulatory affairs? Was it a manager? Was it a peer? Was it someone new? Was it someone experienced? And once you have these questions, you can sit down later and look through them, and it'll be more accurate, the words that the controlled languages you pick, the natural language that you write, and the access points you use, because you'll have real data to do it with. So that's sort of just the first step, getting your pantry in order, right? Because you want to be able to find everything. You want to store it the right way. You want everybody to be able to walk in and pull the lemons off the lemon shelf. And the things you need to do. So this is just the beginning. As I said, we did 3 sessions on this, which is, pretty good actually for a 2-day seminar. It goes a lot deeper than this typically, and it's much more of a workshop than a teaching session. There's all kinds of things you need to consider, though, when you're constructing your user profiles and when you're constructing your questions and when you're constructing your examples that you're going to test. All library science things can be absolutely tested, right? Clinically tested almost to the point. You want to think of content life cycles. Everybody in the life cycle, from start to finish, not just your end users, but you, who creates it, who consumes it, who produces it, and who maintains it. Right? How many audiences are there? How many roles are there? What are the permissions? What's your organizational scheme? And thinking about your components. What's a staple and what's a specialty? Right? What things happen all the time and what things happen rare enough that we want to look at? Sometimes you may want to think about, when did we put this feature in the manual? In what version did we put it? How easy is that to find given what you have now? But these kinds of historical tracking information, these are things also you are asked to know. You're asked to find out, right? Because something could happen and legal comes to you all of a sudden and says, when did you change the language? That may not be so easy to identify. But if you've got a good pantry and you've figured out your metadata and you've really looked at all these other components, it should be a pretty straightforward question to ask and answer. And so that's what we do. So that's the end of these 3 sessions. The videos are on YouTube. This one will be there also. Type in some questions. Let's talk about what your metadata is. We've got a few minutes left. In the meantime, our next session in the TC Dojo is on reuse, because that's one of the most requested topics in the survey. How to reuse it, how to find reuse, how to manage it, how to maintain it, how to collaborate about it. Our guest dojo master is lined up, but we're still waiting on a couple of details. So either sign up for the registration link, because the webinar is created, at least on GoToMeeting, or sign up for the newsletter, and you'll be the first to know when we post the details. It should be any day now. In the meantime, however, we have Misty Berry from Salesforce coming in 2 weeks, I believe, 23rd of September. She's going to talk about how and why Salesforce has gotten rid of inline manual linking. Those manually coded inline links, they got rid of them, and we'll talk about why they did. And it's actually a fascinating session, and we'll see you on that date. So in the meantime, while you're waiting to find out what the dojo is doing, come see Misty talk about inline linking and what it costs and who uses it and why they do and why they don't. Our next master series is in 1 week from now. Master series is virtual discussion groups. So it's not a presentation, it's not a teaching session, it's sort of the equivalent of your networking at a conference or at a meeting. This is the combination of what we learned from TC Camp, actually, which is all dynamic. Users come, people come to the master series, they bring their own questions, their own issues that they're dealing with at any point in time, and we learn from each other, right? Because everybody's at different points and everybody's learned different lessons, and we all learn from each other, and that's what the master series does. All right, great. So thanks for coming. I'm going to post this video to the YouTube channel. That is the link there. I need to fix that. So that's a 1 for sure, not an L. Are there any questions? So far, I don't see any. All right, well, hopefully you learned a lot, and we enjoy doing these. If there's a session you would prefer to see, make sure you sign up at the survey and tell us what you want to learn. It's not about us. It's not what we want to teach you. It's what you want to learn, but metadata and that kind of stuff was one of the top topics on the survey, and so hopefully we've covered that at least to get you started. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.